I'm John Levine. Welcome to the Berkeley Writers at Work 30th Anniversary audio series. Berkeley Writers at Work launched in 1997 as a forum for campus writers to discuss their writing process. Since then, we have interviewed dozens of faculty writers from the departments of history, psychology, public policy, ethnic studies, and mathematics, just to name a few, to talk about how, where, and when they write. In celebration of UC Berkeley's college writing program's 30th anniversary, we are looking inward, turning the microphone towards our own writers, the vastly talented CWP lecturers, many of whom are successful writers in their own right. For more information about Berkeley Writers at Work, be sure to visit our website at writing.berkeley.edu. In this episode, poets Miriam Greenberg and Belinda Kremer each read selections from their published poetry collections, and then they talk about inspirations for their poems, from the Cypress freeway collapse after the Loma Prieta earthquake to the September 11th attacks and the loss of loved ones. They also share ideas about language precision and their approaches to revising their writing.
So we are happy to be here as part of the college writing program's 30th anniversary year, in which we have a lot of our own faculty having conversations and interviews with each other about their writing practices as part of the Berkeley Writers at Work program. So thanks to John Levine for organizing that program and these sessions. I'm Belinda Kremer, and Miriam Greenberg and I will be speaking today to each other about poetry and the writing process. And Miriam, I'm just going to ask you, how would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
That's a good question. And I start to think, what's the scope of that question? My name is Miriam Greenberg. I'm a poet. I like to say that I'm an occasional essayist, but my history of prose writing is spotty. Belinda and I both teach in the college writing programs at UC Berkeley. What else might I say?
I think whatever you want to say. So we've got our, people listening, undergraduates. I think identifying yourself as a poet and faculty member here is good for now, if it's good for you. And I think we were going to have you start off by reading a poem or two for us.
Sure. So I'm going to read the poem, Would You Believe? It's the first poem in my first book, which is called In the Volcano's Mouth. And just to give it a tiny bit of context, I wrote this in 2014. It takes place, or a glimpse of it at least, takes place 3 blocks from the Cypress freeway in Oakland, which collapsed in the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake.
Yeah.
And it's just if it's helpful to know, it's kind of about, I spent a lot of my 20s and early mid-30s hitchhiking and hopping freight trains around the US. So some of it can be contextualized in that world or that scene. Would you believe? We climbed from the mouth of a volcano all year. The year I moved west with my sweetheart to live 3 blocks from where the earth had broken open. Men in the Acorn Project remembered pulling strangers trapped in their cars to safety. Brother, one had told me, he'd said, "We can be afraid of each other again tomorrow." 20 years passed. They'd made good on their promise. By then, I waited weekly in a food line alongside Chinese immigrant women who fished plastic bottles from the trash, eyes roving for a coin, a lost prize at the curb. Sometimes I'd lift my hand to the lip, look out over the volcano's rim, and there in a crevice, a scrap of paper shining, someone's private prayer or prophecy. Everybody held out hope, tended their small hustle. Women knocked on the door selling broken-heeled shoes, loquats picked in an abandoned yard, would try the knob if no one was home. Could I make change for a 20? Asked someone, unfolding one she'd manufactured from a dollar bill. Would you believe what lengths I went to call myself happy then? Star of blood that blooms beneath a bruised fingernail, star of silence left high in the heart of a room after the doors slammed. A couple sits, watching one another's reflections in a mirror. The two talk like this as evening falls around them, and neither has the heart to get up and turn on the light. My body's here, but no one's in it, writes a friend, the writer Sue Moon. For me, it's different. I'd spent my childhood in a house made of bees. On hot days, honey dripped through cracks in the ceiling. Me, I hummed, coiled tight. It hadn't been long since I'd slept in a creosote field, while grainers crashed in the switchyard nearby. Actual tumbleweeds turned like prayer wheels crossing the tracks, and the constellations coyotes called to, streaked across the night, were more miraculous than freckles on the face of God. Around then, hitchhiking past Death Valley, a pair of truckers stopped for me. I used to haul cattle to LAX, one said, but I couldn't take looking into their mournful eyes anymore. I guess I wear my heart on my sleeve, he said. They were climbing through the Sierras to pick up a load of honey, telling jokes. They both had wild white beards. I hadn't yet come in my life to peer over the lip of a volcano. I wasn't yet made of a cicada's coils and timble. Still, I carried a bit of string, a kipu I used for eavesdropping on the passage of time. If someone had put a knife in my hands, even then, I'd have taken it. I can hear two birds quarreling, tangled in midair. I'm afraid I'll find myself trash picking one day, tearing corners from a 20. I'm afraid I'm no longer lost as the runaway I met, hopping a train out of Colton that summer, who carried a small jar of her own baby teeth with her in her pack. That's a long one.
Wow, thank you for reading that. I loved hearing it. We've recently exchanged our books with each other and are fairly new readers of each other's work. That is one of my favorites in your book. I'm so glad you chose to read that. Maybe since we've just heard that specific poem, we could hear a little bit from you about your writing process, somewhat as it relates to that actual poem and this book, if you're able to. Like, what got you started with this?
Oh, interesting. So, when I first started working on this book, I had a writing residency, which is this kind of lucky, miraculous thing. But in general, I tend to write poetry in these really immersive manic bursts. So I'll write 2 or 3 poems. They're not all good, but like 2 or 3 poems every single day, or 4 poems or 5 poems. Really when I'm at that many, they're definitely not all good. Mm-hmm. But I'll write enormously over like a 2 or 3 or 4 week period. Mm-hmm. And I'll really accomplish the sort of backbone of a project. And then if I'm lucky, I'll put them in order and think about them as a sort of structured sequence of interworked narratives. And so I had this residency and I was writing these poems, and I remember thinking, these are the best things I've ever written in my life.
Yay.
And yeah, totally. And like when you're first becoming a writer, you have that feeling, like that feeling is so essential. You have that feeling every time you write a poem sometimes. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you also think, this is the worst thing I've ever written in my life. But you have that feeling, and then like a few weeks or years or months later, you come back and think, maybe that's fine, but it's nothing special, right? Mm. And I still love these poems. I still think that they are just really well made. But a couple years ago, I went back and looked at the first drafts that I was so proud of. I hadn't looked at them in years. Mm-hmm. And you know what? They were just as bad as any first draft, any mediocre, shitty first draft that never gets out of my notebook. There was nothing special about them, except that somehow the ego buoyed me through the process of revising and revising and revising and refining them until they became things that I'm still really deeply proud of. Mm-hmm. So, shall I pass the torch to you? Would you like to read something from your book?
Sure, I can read something.
As the spirit moves you.
Sure. What I actually wanted to read is something different from the book that I shared with you, which is Decoherence, and that takes its title from the quantum mechanics principle of physical particles actually decohering, or essentially coming apart as the initial state of matter, and then things come back together and cohere. So it's kind of about initial states and transformation of matter and all sorts of things. I do like that book, and I still feel proud of that book. I also have that icky feeling we can often have. I loved hearing you say, you like these poems and come back to them. I totally recognize that thing that many, I feel like poets especially will say, is that I wrote the book and I got it out and then I can't bear to look at it. All the wonderful threads of, like why I hate poetry, so our favorite books, and our sort of like love-hate relationship with it that can be, so hard, I think, to almost understand. And yet, anytime I do actually open published work, I do like it. But it is funny that, with a closed cover of my own book or small artist books or chapbooks or things that have appeared in literary magazines, I will feel this almost fear like opening it up and looking at it. And I'm always fascinated by that. But I had a slightly different experience just in this past 5 days or so. I traveled to Oahu for a memorial for my great Auntie Bootsy, love you, Auntie Boo, who had passed at 90 in late February and was the youngest of 9, where my grandmother, Lucia Montijo, was the oldest of the 9. And it was wonderful to go and to be with family and all that. And it just reminded me of some poems that I had written in an earlier time in the years of my grandmother's death, which was 2001, and which also came very close on September 11th, 2001. And I was living in Brooklyn at that time. And myself and my girlfriend did actually see the Twin Towers burning, saw the second plane hit, or in our memory, we folded in all those newsreels, but if we didn't actually see the second plane go in, we saw the second building go up in smoke seconds after. I think with all that looping moment of that plane hitting, we can all think we've seen it if we haven't. But in the aftermath of that time, I wrote a series of poems that were also kind of every day, sometimes several times a day, almost more like in a diary, sometimes at the site of the Twin Towers, sometimes in Brooklyn, certainly on that day. And I was processing both being new to New York and being a California born and raised and nature-loving person, being new to New York, having just lost my grandmother, who was quite important to us. And then September 11th happened as I was quite new to this city, and there was just like kind of a lot of losses and changes happening. And one of the things that really kind of will get me writing, it does tend to be some big emotional force or some problem I don't know I need to solve. So this is from a little collection that I put out as an artist book called Blue, Poems for New York. And it's a series of kind of diaristic poems that begin on that day and move forward. And I just felt, having been with my family and having buried my beloved auntie, I was just sort of, I guess something in me needed to come back to this work about loss and change and something a little bit less abstract than the book. So I thought I'd read a couple of things from here. We're just going to have some paper sounds for a moment while I do that. So I want to read this poem, October 27th, 2001, Coney Island. And these poems all have the dates on which the work originated. So it's kind of spanning. I feel a little old manish lately. I might tell you my back hurts. I think some kids took something of mine. Likely, I mean something else. The empty beach and boardwalk today. Just 3 men casting from the pier, and sometimes huddled in bright blue nylon domes. The misanthrope cares not too little, but too much. A subway car becomes a flood, overwhelms. I look away, I say, my back hurts, I think some kids took something of mine. Is that all? Here on the groomed beach, the single narrative is the wet-suited figure 8 feet into the surf, skimming for coins. In the quiet cold, belted for the season, the cyclone and wonder wheel cry out. More lonely for passengers with none than with a few, though not everyone would agree. A swallow tries for height in the cold October air. Failing describes a beautiful loop or two.
One thing that I notice in this is this repetition of images, but also repetition of specific lines and phrases, which I also notice in your book, in Decoherence. And this kind of iterative reworking of an idea over and over through a poem. I wonder, let me ask you specifically, tell me about why you do that, and tell me how that fits into revision or into your life as a writer, as somebody whose work, is in conversation with itself over, years, over decades.
So I think one thing I have to watch out for is that kind of looping back to certain images or moments, and to make sure that if I'm doing that, there is a sort of a building through repetition, or some kind of question is being asked to the thing I'm returning to. I think I will often kind of return to obsessions in poems, and in this case, kind of the emptiness of Coney Island at that time, which was quite unusual for October, is very odd. And these kind of single figures everywhere just felt to me like those had that sense of kind of loss and emptiness that was all around in usually the strangely crowded New York City. Something I have to watch out for in revising poems and developing them is that with those repetitions of things, I can also often start them with an and or a but, or kind of uninteresting to me, connective material or prepositions. And I need to watch out for that and kind of hope that the return to repeated images kind of create a sort of a ghost pattern of each other or populate the poem more richly. it all seems a little abstract answering that way, but that is part of the process. What about revision process for you? Or
So when I think about revision, I'll say that I didn't learn how to revise until I wrote this book in 2014. And for context, I went to a fancy private high school as a scholarship student, and I got to take creative writing classes, so I had been writing and thinking of myself as a writer since I was like 14 years old. Like I had been, attempting to revise and hearing about and learning about and et cetera, revision for 20 years. But in my experience, I would start to write, and if the poem came out kind of well, then I would keep working on it. But I didn't really know how to fundamentally shift things. If it didn't come out kind of well, I would say, well, okay, that was a nice draft. I'll, maybe think about how to write those ideas in some other way in the future. And my primary strategy for revision was coming back to the ideas in a new form later. And with this book, somehow I was kind of able to let go of the ego involved. So not only the ego, but like that sense when you write a poem, what comes along with it is so much of or when you write anything, when I look at student essays in R1A, which I teach, so many students, and I as a poet, have trouble differentiating between what's on the page and what the spirit, the atmosphere, the ideas that are present in their own minds, but that won't be present for a reader who isn't familiar with a broader work or isn't familiar with, the argument that they're trying to make because we've been talking about it. This is the first book project that I've ever worked on that I was able to separate myself from those ghosts, the ghosts of the idea that this sort of atmosphere that I feel is inherent to the poem, but that, only for me. And I think that made me so much more clear-eyed about how language actually works, about what the stories I was actually telling were, and, how I was wielding sound or pacing or, all of these kind of craft questions that you encounter too as a writer of, fiction or prose or, of any sort, and that, that are often sometimes equally important to the argument or the narrative itself.
Well, maybe having said those things, would you maybe read us one more poem from the book? We just had one before.
Let's read this. This is the last one in the book.
Okay, great. So we have the bookends.
The first and the last are also my two favorite poems. This one is called After I Die. After I die, I am reborn as an animal that breaks into dental clinics long after sundown to suck laughing gas from its dark mask. I am reborn as an animal that keeps watch on the liquor store until the lights flick off, or later. The animal that sings its ballads to the cattails, which is the same animal whose hands close over the shape of baby birds in low nests. This is an animal that carries a gold-rimmed teacup and kisses the ravenous night with all its teeth before sinking them into the leg of its benefactor. Among the cemetery with its lonesome chill, the animal made of shadow has touched the breast of a woman who laid down with the dead. This animal picks names from the phone book and sleeps very lightly beneath their window or wakes late for a cigarette, and its smoke drifts into their dreams. Once, there was an animal just like this who was left newly born in a box on the steps of a temple in an old country, and the priest blessed it in a bath of milk and made it jump through the fire. The animal came to glitter like pyrite. The animal shivered like gold flecking the stones of a chilly river. The animal was caused by a minor devil to stumble, and for that it was cast off like the disheveled skin of a spirit. In slumber, the animal set out for its fortune, and in slumber came to a farm where animals were slaughtered. Needing food, he asked for a job. To pull a blade through the feathers of an animal, to pour out its blood as if from the mouth of a bottle, and blanch it, and put handfuls of its feathers into a bag coarsely, like paper money of no remaining value. Then cut open its small chest where the organs glisten like jewels in their shawl of blood. The animal may go on doing this forever. It may have to. The animal is accustomed to count discreetly, to curry small favor, to stop for its bottle, hidden in an abandoned bunker somewhere, and to drink it there, in peace, if it can. The animal's soul is contained in a separate vessel.
Thank you for reading that. Before we began our conversation here, one of the things we talked about, and one of the things that John often likes to talk about in the Berkeley Writers at Work series, is the question you raised about ordering things in a manuscript and how that happens. And so since you did happen to read us both the first and the last, and name them as your favorites, and I'm going to say that last is so powerful and so precise in that imagery of the abattoir or the slaughterhouse, and yet there's so much beauty in it, like the glistening gems, and it's so precise in its figurative language, you know, the blood pouring out as if from a bottle. It's beautiful, and it is harsh and lonely and hard about our shared animal connections and things. I think there's so much power in it. How did you decide to end with that poem?
I don't have a good answer for you. I also need to say, because I feel like being able to be precise in these ways is just such a magical experience. One of the things that I'm just so delighted about in my own writing process is being able to capture that kind of precision of not only an idea, but the way that it kind of exists in a folktale-like space. And because of that, I tend to think of poems like this as really funny, which I know, you know, at reading them or listening to them, that might not be your experience. And so it's, again, it's always, I think that disjunct between writer and reader is always a little bit larger than I'm able to recognize in my own work. I don't know how I ended with this, but in general, I like to start projects with a strong narrative through line, a clear sort of driving narrative focus. And because I'm a poet and not a fiction writer, my narrative usually kind of falls apart. It goes from a sort of plot-driven narrative or a, you know, literal, more reportage-based narrative to something that's more metaphorical or emotional or tonal. And you don't get the satisfaction of a clean narrative ending that you might map out with the like rising action. And so I think this is probably sort of shifts to diffusion. It decoheres, and it usually doesn't cohere in a recognizable way. So what about you? What's your experience of ordering a manuscript or ordering, you know, a series of complex ideas in whatever form they take, you know, as a teacher, as a writer, not just of poetry?
I will start with poetry, though. I will say I think it can very much depend on the kind of thing. So what I like is that there's real variety in that. So the little chapbook blue that I was reading from had a natural order to it in that I started writing things that appear in that book on September 11th, 2001. And, you know, I wrote all through that fall and into the winter, but whatever ended up in this book, it did have a natural order in that I did want to keep an allegiance to the dates that these were written on, and I did want the dates to go forward. So there are definitely gaps between dates and things, and in that sense, something that is somewhat diaristic has a sort of natural order. And then the big question is, right, what to take out, because everything won't fit. So I think in ordering things, I tend to start with a big mishmash of everything and then cut, which is often my, you know, advice to student writers, whether it's like an essay or a fiction or a collection of things. When I am ordering a smaller book, like a chapbook or artist book or a bigger manuscript, I will print things out and tack them up on the wall with blue tap or tape so I can see them and walk around a room sort of physically and spatially within the book and switch things around or take them down and move them up. And I find that really helpful to actually inhabit the space of the book as if it's a physical landscape that I am walking through, like both through time and kind of space and imagery. I actually love that process of shaping things. If I have something that isn't so naturally connected by date, I guess I am looking for a narrative to emerge across the poems. And I do write really different kinds of work, so things that are precise in their detail and imagery, whether concrete or figurative, and things that are much more purposefully tonal, where I want the mood and the sounds of the language to kind of create a sensory experience that I have a goal for, a sensory and emotional experience. In ordering things like that, I will read the things aloud over and over again and try to get a sense of what they sound like, even knowing the reader might encounter them on the page. So I think different things, different ways. My favorite advice to poets that I work with at Berkeley and elsewhere is to look at the beginning of something, the level of the individual poem. And I take advice that was given to me long ago that we're often just still clearing our throats at the beginning of our work. We'll say, well, you're there may be a stronger beginning here. What do you think?
Almost always.
Yeah, I had a wonderful experience with an R4A student of mine just today who they were doing creative responses to the Tochi Onyebuchi novel Riot Baby, a speculative fiction about the near future with very intense themes of state-sponsored and structural racism and police brutality, but also agency and resistance. And we're analyzing the novel, but also responding to it creatively. And my student, Kara, who I'll just identify by first name, created a wonderful digital chapbook of 6 poems. And we just conferenced on it a couple days ago. And she so strongly improved several of those poems after we talked about just one of them and the suggestion that, maybe the first 4 or 5 lines could completely go. And at first she was shocked, she's like, but I kind of like those lines. It's like, it's completely up to you because, you're the poet, but she gave it a shot. And in fact, it was stronger. And then I got to see that on her own, she went through the other 6 poems in that chapbook.
Interesting.
And essentially they kind of all start somewhere different than they had started. And I think in general, we can get quite attached to our beginnings. They're often the parts that we rework the most. And so whether that's an individual poem or whether like a piece is the right piece for a collection or whether the first paragraph is the right one for an essay, I think one of my favorite things to do is be willing to put that starting point on the chopping block completely.
Yeah.
And you may find really, surprising and interesting things. So yeah, I love deleting as part of revising, whatever that looks like.
Really. One assignment that I often give when I teach poetry classes is usually towards the end of the semester to pick a poem that you've worked with before, the poem of your own that just isn't working, but that you really love. And to imagine the, 4 or 5 or 6 parallel lives it could lead. So to write, to revise it 4 or 5 or 6 times, not sequentially as we tend to think of poetry revision, but in parallel so that if you feel really precious about that beginning, you can keep it in one version and then take it away entirely and see how it lives and evolves and becomes in another version. And I feel like being able to let go of that sense of preciousness is just so powerfully beneficial for my work and for students' work, even if in the end you come back and you say, wow, that beginning really was good. Like being able to let go of it long enough and sincerely enough to see what happens is really, really valuable.
Yeah, I love that idea of not revising linearly, right? Version, but in other words, like we have the poem and then the poem just became quintuplets or sextuplets, right? You're saying these are all different from each other and then like kind of like, maybe choose one of them to hold on to. On that note of like revision and deletion and taking things out, I think we are about to take ourselves out. We're kind of at our sort of half-hour mark of our conversation, which is what we were aiming at. Any closing thoughts? I think for me, I just want to say thanks again to John Levine and Berkeley Writers at Work and to college writing programs and to say how much I've enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, this has been really fun. It's also been so nice to have a good reason to sit down with your work and think really carefully about it. I feel like I'm so bad at prioritizing. Lately, teaching has been taking up my life, and I'm delighted by it. This is a relatively new job for me. I really enjoy it. And so the part of me that would be fiddling with tiny pieces of poems is now fiddling with like lesson plans or grading, which is kind of less fun. But, and so it's nice to have like an assignment to sit down with your work and
make time for poetry. Yeah.
And I feel like, as a writer, like that's how I keep myself writing is I have to have these like some kind of deadline. Otherwise, I can always do it tomorrow. My mind goes and eventually enough tomorrows and, we've wound down our clock. But anyway, thank you so much for facilitating. And I truly appreciate getting to chat.
Yeah, me too. And thank you to Betsy, our recorder, sound engineer. Okay, make time for poetry, kids. Bye.
Yeah.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening to Berkeley Writers at Work audio series, a production of the college writing programs at UC Berkeley. You can find more information about our program at writing.berkeley.edu. I'm John Levine.